Hey everyone, my name is Richard Sharp, and I am presenting on the role of new media and technologies in educating at risk students. Just a little introduction. Um, I thought about first what does an excellent teacher do, and I feel like that's someone who makes decisions that allow all students to achieve at a similar rate, regardless of ability level. Because I've taught in a lot of inclusion model classes, and I know that a lot of schools around New York State as well as the country are sort of switching to an inclusion model classroom, which is including students with disabilities and English language learners alongside the general education students. You obviously have a wide range of student ability levels to keep in mind. So I started off with an initial thesis of English language learners and students with disabilities will perform at an increased rate of academic achievement and social development when provided with opportunities to engage in multimodal forms of learning through the use of new media and technologies. I decided to first focus on English language learners and research that surrounds how new media and technology would affect those students in classrooms. The first journal article that I looked at was written by Miller and Heigelheimer. They used real world computer simulations in an attempt to impact vocabulary retention of English language learners. The participants actually played the video game The Sims. Alongside, they had supplemental materials as well on a screen next to the screen where they were playing The Sims. And the authors analyzed quiz scores, questionnaires, and post project survey responses. Some conclusions that Miller and Heigelheimer came up with were explicit vocabulary instruction was affected rather vocabulary acquisition. So there was actually some minimal direct instruction that the students participated in as well, but they also used the simulation task using the Sims computer game along with the supplemental materials I mentioned previously, and they found that that indeed did promote vocabulary development in English language learners. The second article I looked at regarding English language learners was research written by Chen and Brown. They studied the impact of computer mediated communication, or CMC, on English language learners' writing. The way they did this was participants created three different types of websites: a travel website, a State Department website, and a Culture Gap website related to their native language. And they measured participant responses through post-task interviews. Some conclusions that Chen and Brown came up with were that participants generally held a positive view of the task-based computer-created approach. This positive view was due to the mitigation of audience abstraction, or because the participants felt like they were creating these websites for a real-world audience, then it allowed them real-world application of the English language, and therefore helped them feel more motivated and engaged in what the activity was asking them to do. After I did the research on the English language learners and use of new media and technology in educating those students, I switched gears and looked at the students with disabilities research regarding how these digital platforms affected those students' development in the classroom. The first article that I read regarding research with students with disabilities was written by Moore. She investigated the use of social stories on social development of students with disabilities. Specifically, she mentioned autism as one of those disabilities. The digital stories were created using representations of social situations that the students would see in everyday life. And some stories were created with the input of students, while others involved the students as characters in these stories. Some conclusions Moore came to were that students with disabilities were likely to avoid learned helplessness because of the fact that they felt engaged in what they were doing in creating these stories. The students with disabilities also took ownership over their own learning, and this also increased attention due to the use of familiar people and settings within these stories. Similarly, research done by Hop, she investigated the use of a computer program called Check and Connect and how that impacted transitional behavior for students with disabilities. The participants used the program for 3 hours a week, and the program focused specifically on problem areas within four constructs: work-related, interpersonal, social and community, and overall. Her conclusions were very strong in that students' average quotient scores increased between pre and post ratings, and there was actually improvement across all four areas. The third piece of research I looked at regarding students with disabilities and new media and technologies was written by Reagan, Berkeley, Hughes, and Kirby. This kind of switched gears from going to discussing how students with disabilities would be affected by these digital platforms with behavior over to how that would actually impact them academically and specifically in this case regarding reading. They investigated the use of or the effects of computer-assisted instruction on elementary school readers with disabilities using a program called Lexia SOS. This software was used for multiple sessions, and then a few participants also received minimal direct instruction prior to using the Lexia SOS as well. They found that Lexia SOS improved students' abilities to decode new sentences and information, and then it actually also improved the consistency of decoding as well, not just the actual ability to do so. I then changed focus and thought about the reasons for new media and technology's impact on ELLs and students with disabilities achievement. The first reason why I found that students with disabilities and English language learners benefited greatly from the use of new media and technologies in the classroom were that it greatly improved student engagement and motivation. Students struggle to maintain motivation and engagement in traditional passive schooling, which Gunther Kress mentioned in his article, The Profound Shift of Digital Literacies. And the multimodal nature of digital media offers engagement of children who grew up in the 21st century. Because students in at-risk populations often have a deficit of social and academic capital, in other words, they're farther behind than their peers, motivation and engagement are a big issue in the classroom and a big obstacle for these students to achieve. But if we use digital media and platforms that they're used to being engaged in perhaps at home, then we can increase their motivation and engagement within the classroom. The second reason for students within at-risk populations to benefit from these digital media and technologies is that they offer real-world authenticity. Digital simulations create environments for students with disabilities as well as English language learners to make personal connections to the real world, which Miller and Heigelheimer discussed. Digital storytelling incorporates familiar people and settings, which Moore discussed as well. And digital platforms offer students ways to understand material that are personally meaningful, which Nixon mentioned in her article within the New Media and Literacies Reader. Because students with disabilities and English language learners also need to make direct connections to the material they're learning, it's important that using these digital media and new technologies, we can actually emphasize those bridges for students to create on their own so that they also take ownership over their own learning because they have a personal attachment to the material being discussed. Last, but certainly not the least reason why new media and technologies benefit students within at-risk populations is that they offer a great level of differentiation. Differentiation is crucial in inclusion model classrooms in order to make the material accessible for all of the students within the class. Computer programs often have built-in differentiation components, and this differentiation in new media and technologies is user-driven and not instructor-driven. The importance of this is that an instructor before a class can create a worksheet that's tailored to an individual student and kind of adjust for each student within the class, which obviously requires a lot of time and effort. But as the class goes on, they're stuck with just using that worksheet. However, new media and technologies can offer a situation where the programs will actually differentiate for the user and for the student using the program as the program is being used, so that if, let's say, a student gets 4 of the next 4 questions correct in a certain area or certain component of a program, then the computer program knows that student is ready to move on to the next level and can immediately provide that level of differentiation so that the student goes from something that they're now mastered to something that they need to work on next. So now that I've discussed the research and some reasons for why new media and technologies benefit students within the classroom, especially within at-risk populations such as English language learners and students with disabilities, I'd like to return to my thesis that I mentioned at the beginning of the presentation and discuss how I would like to adapt it. My adaptive thesis, which I've adapted now that I've looked at research and figured out what connections there were between each of these different research pieces, is that English language learners and students with disabilities will perform at an increased rate of academic achievement and social development when provided with opportunities to engage in multimodal forms of learning through the use of new media and technologies because of extrinsic motivation and engagement it offers, development of authentic real-world scenarios and simulations, and user-driven differentiation. And that marks the end of my presentation. I hope you found it very informative, and if you have any questions or comments, please feel free to comment on the discussion thread where this will be posted. Thank you.